Hello, everyone. I'm very excited today to be talking with Razib Khan, a geneticist, population geneticist. And I've been following your work since a really long time, partly because we have similar interests. I'm fascinated by evolutionary psychology and biology and anthropology, and those are the things that you mostly write about. Also, because you've been on the internet since like forever. I think I found you through Robert Wright's blogging heads or meaning of life, I think it's called now. So both of you have kind of been on the internet forever. So why don't you give a bit of a background of yourself and uh, tell me also about the early days of the internet because you've been vlogging since 1990s.
So a little bit about myself. I'm trained as a biologist and also like undergraduate background is in chemistry actually, but I'm a geneticist. I have a startup, it's called Generate. It's business to business platform. I don't really talk about that too much. I talk about it somewhat. I have a podcast for that company as well, actually, called the Generate Podcast, if anyone wants to look that up. I also have a Substack now, razib.substack.com. I'm probably going to put out razibkhan.com soon. But anyway, I do my writing about genetics and all sorts of other topics there. Before that, I had a blog called Gene Expression. That blog was around since the spring of 2022. I also have a blog called Brown Pundits that started December of 2010. I've written for New York Times, The Scientist, Slate. I've written for India Today. Honestly, I've written for places I forget about, places that aren't on the internet anymore because they're webzines and sometimes websites go down. Obviously, I started to do some podcasting and some video. So I had a podcast called The Insight, which went on evolution and genetics a couple of years ago for a company I worked at. And now I have my own podcast that I do on my Substack. And, I've been a guest on a variety of other podcasts. Mostly I talk about genetics, history. Sometimes I talk about like kind of political things, but not like super political, I would say. But like Unheard likes me to write about India because they like what I write about India. But I'm not really Indian. I just read about it on the internet and have Indian friends. But they like my perspective. So I don't know. I look brown, so that's they think I know something naturally. But yeah, so that's a lot of the stuff I do. By day, I'm a startup tech guy. That's my scene, scientist turned entrepreneur. By night, I have Substack and I just do stuff on the internet. Like, yeah, I've been around for a while. I guess my first blog was in the fall of 2021. That one I deleted. Like I was actually um so if you want me to jump into like the early days of the internet in the 1990s, there were things like GeoCities, there was your own personal web page. They were very expressive and creative, and obviously you could do, some of your viewers remember MySpace, but it was like MySpace, but way more primitive. So you just like HTML, write your own um, website, and most people would have, there was proto blogging, pre-blogging software, not even software like Microsoft Front Page, other things, and you would just update your website and people would check it every now and then if there was an update. So I did some of that actually, and I was I was an undergraduate, I was young, teenager back then. So, I'm glad that none of that has been cached in the Internet Archive, I think. I remember when I was an undergraduate, so it's like the way it would work is like university.edu, / and then tilde and your email username. And that's how people could find you, your website, because your university would automatically give you that and that directory. And so some of my friends started like looking at my stuff and I was like, oh, that's super weird. And so I wasn't super comfortable with it initially. And then I just got over it with the blog. And what I was originally doing is I was working as a web developer actually in the early 2000s after graduating college. I didn't really want to do science anymore. I was kind of turned off by molecular biology, and I just like wrote blog software for me to blog initially before I moved to Blogspot. And I went to Blogspot, Iraq War, a lot of people were commenting, a lot of people were having opinions. And I kind of like fell into that, and I actually got I rekindled my interest in genetics, actually just writing about science, because genetic stories or genetic papers would always kind of be more interesting to me. And that's how I actually ended up going back to graduate school at UC Davis to study genetics, genomics. So once genomics became a thing, I got really, really into science again. So genomics, as in like the computational aspect of big data genetics, as opposed to what I was trained as a biochemist as an undergraduate, which was, ultimately not that interesting to me. So that's kind of like the trajectory. And in terms of the early days of blogging, one thing I will say is there were periods when people were much more open to engaging with the other side, or what didn't really matter as much. Like maybe like in 2003, it was super chill. And then the Iraq war heated up and it was very polarized for about 3 years. And then everyone kind of didn't want to talk about Iraq anymore. And for a couple of years, it was super chill, especially like the first year of Obama or so maybe. And then all of a sudden it got polarized again because Obama was like a Kenyan socialist or something. And, it's been like that since then. It's gotten worse and worse and worse. And it's kind of sad. But yeah, so that would be like my capsule summary.
Do you think this is perhaps because of this is something which goes in ebbs and flows, or is this because of uh, a concerted ideological attack or ideological capture of the institutions?
I think so. It's not even an institution, it's just like communities. And what happens is over time, there's a positive feedback loop. The louder and the more extreme voices tend to dominate, tend to kind of become more and more prominent. And eventually they swamp out all the people in the middle. The people in the middle are by their nature more compromising, and they don't want to punch right, they don't want to punch left. And so you have a situation where there's like a feedback loop, and eventually everyone just becomes extremist because moderates get hit from both sides. Like if you're an extremist, you get hit from the other side, but you don't get hit from your own side. And so I think it is just like a reinforcing feedback loop within these communities. And the way it shatters is there's a consensus that shatters about something. So for example, initially after 9/11, the United States was pretty unified, and then there started to be like divisions due to the Iraq war, and left and right just kind of like organized around that. And I think that there was a kind of a detente, or kind of like a second, a second dawn of kind of discourse for a couple of years after everyone kind of agreed Iraq was wrong, or just like we want to be out of there, right and left. So there's no polarization on that. People were trying to sort themselves out. And and then obviously Obama became very polarizing for a while. And that was a thing. And then after Obama is Trump, that became extremely polarizing, right? So everybody in the middle just kind of gets winnowed away in these sorts of tribal fights.
So you've also been well, victim of cancel culture, and we'll talk a bit about that perhaps later. But uh, I want to start by talking a bit about the genetic landscape of India, because I read an essay that you wrote in a book that was compiled by Romila Thapar. I think
Oh,
it
that was a
was,
long time ago. Yeah, it was a while
uh,
ago. I wrote that in 2019, I think, right?
yes, I think it was, yeah, around 2019.
Mhm.
So, and the sense that I got after reading that book, which was very short, and your essay, is that we that there's so much diversity that we know we can say very little with certainty. Has your views changed since you wrote that essay, or how has the evidence been?
Yeah, I mean, so okay, I mean, I don't want to say we can say very little with certainty, but we can say a lot of big issues with great certainty, but a lot of specific things with less certainty. Does that make sense? So for example, I have a pretty high certainty that, like a very, very high certainty that around 4,000 years ago, Indo-Aryans migrated into the Indian subcontinent from the Khyber Pass, through the Khyber Pass, and their ultimate genealogical origins go to the South Urals and beyond that to like Belarusia, in the eastern edge of the corded ware culture. Like I have that with a very high certainty. But ask me about like how the Jats came to be, or Jat, I don't know how to say it, but That is like much more speculative because it's a very fine grained, precise question that you're trying to test, and you need a lot more data to contextualize. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So on the Aryan issue, who were the Aryans? And do you think that there was a migration, which is, I think, the majority view of the scholars right now, or is there any chance of there being violence when these two groups came into contact?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of who they were, like since I wrote that, there's been a little bit more work. So there's one branch, I think I forget which sub branch is in the Indian subcontinent. There's one branch of R1A, which is a Y chromosome lineage, like I carry it, 25% of men in the Indian subcontinent carry it. And that is shared with Eastern Europeans. And the branch that's called Z93, it's a particular mutation that is found in Asia, Indian subcontinent, Iran, seems to be correlated with the Indo-Iranians, which is separate from the Slavic and Germanic branches of R1A. Okay. So the earliest Z93 that I think we can find right now is in Eastern Europe, is in, again, like Belarusia, Western Russia, Northern Ukraine, that area. And then, you have like downstream mutations of Z93 that are happening to the east and the south. And so it's pretty clear to me now that the precursor, so the Indo-Aryans, their precursors were out of something called the Andronovo horizon. Probably, though not definitively, there might have been multiple different cultures that are closely related, but probably it was the Santashta culture that created the Andronovo horizon. The Santashta culture themselves descend from a culture to their west called the Balanovo culture, like copper miners. And then they descend from a culture to their west called the Fatinovo culture. Fatinovo culture is like agro-pastoralists, and they themselves descend from an eastern migration out of what's called the corded ware culture. And the corded ware culture is a 3/4 Yamnaya, 1/4 globular amphora. Globular amphora were a Neolithic farmer society that were conquered by the Yamnaya. So we have like a pretty precise genealogy of the origin of the Indo-Iranian people. The toponyms, river landscape features in some parts of Russia are clearly Indo-Iranian. They're like Iranian-like feature. The names are not, they're not Slavic. The Slavs moved into that territory relatively recently within the last, let's say 1500 years, okay, more or less. And so you have a situation where I think you do have a pretty good genealogy of the migration path of the Indo-Aryan and Iranian Aryans and how they came into the subcontinent. The only thing that I would say is, I wouldn't be surprised if there were like more than one migration, a primary or a secondary. I mean, I think the statistical power to detect that relies on ancient DNA, and we have very little ancient DNA from India itself. Right. So the inference from modern DNA and ancient DNA outside of the Indian subcontinent has limitations on its ability to actually project and model certain things to a certain level of granularity. If that makes sense.
So the standard political narrative seems to be that the Dravidians existed in the north and they were pushed down to the south. How much truth is there to that narrative?
Yeah, so again, like I'm not a linguist, but it's based on what I've read. So what I think probably is the case, and I said this on social media recently, is I think that Proto-Dravidian speaking languages exist in the southern part of the Indus River Valley civilization, the IVC, so the southern half. So I think like the Mohenjo-daro side, I think, right? And went to Gujarat. And basically, I think what happened is those people spread using the interior zone, and this is partly based on Peter Bellwood's work with agropastoralism, the ash mound culture. They spread through the interior of the Deccan and kind of expanded outward, right? Probably several migrations, but in any case, so they come from that area. And then the northern part of the IVC is not Indo-European speaking, or is not Dravidian speaking. So because Tamil has, or Tamil, I don't pronounce things correctly. Okay, sorry, just American. But Tamil has, it has Sanskrit words pretty early on, and also the Rig Veda itself has retroflex, Dravidian borrowings. That to me suggests that there's a very close contact between Dravidian speaking people and Indo-Aryan people at very, very early stage. I'm assuming the Rig Veda itself is a composite, and some of it obviously predates being in the Indian subcontinent. Some of the motifs are very old, but a lot of it is original to the Indian subcontinent or synthesized. And so there's Dravidian speaking people, I think, that they're interacting with. Um, and so I think the way you can think about it is the I don't think the IVC, the southern part of the IVC, was Dravidian speaking. I think the Dravidian language zone probably was already well to the south and east of the IVC. I think it expanded southward because you see groups like be concrete about genetically. You see groups like Puliyar, these Dalits or tribal groups in South India. They have like, so they have like 30% West Eurasian ancestry, okay? And you see groups like Reddys or Kamas, and they're like, 45% West Eurasian. And it looks like what happened there was there's these like like more upper caste Dravidian groups that are not Brahmin. They have like more West Eurasian ancestry that's very East Iranian, like the component that's in the IVC. So I think there was later migration southward after an initial migration. But yes, I think the Dravidians migrated out of the Northwest within the last like 4 to 5,000 years. But it's pretty clear that there was a huge interaction zone between them and the Indo-Aryans as the Indo-Aryans were coming in. Right. So I think the Dravidian one of the major Dravidian expansions definitely, I think, postdates the Indo-Aryan arrival, because it looks like all the Dravidians have Indo-Aryan influence and vice versa. Okay. But what I have read is Dravidian toponyms. So these are, again, geographical features that tend to be very conserved. You can find them obviously in Maharashtra, to some extent maybe in Gujarat, maybe even in Sindh. And there's the Brahmi language in Pakistan. And there were like theories about how these are medieval migrants from South India and stuff like that. This is just very unlikely from the genetic perspective. They're genetically exactly like the Baloch, except like they have like less African ancestry because they didn't have as many slaves, So the Brahmi people speak a Dravidian language in the interior of Balochistan. I think that's like quite clear evidence that Dravidian languages were spoken in the Sindh in antiquity. Okay. So in any case, with the Indo-Aryans, the ones that went through the Punjab and kept going eastward, I think they didn't interact with Dravidians really too much, like a little bit, but I don't think that the areas past like the Upper Gangetic, the Doab, the Upper Gangetic area, I don't think they were Dravidian speaking. I think they spoke different languages, some like Aboriginal languages. I don't know what whatever, not Dravidian though. Does that, I mean, I've been going on for a while, but does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm concerned with the origins of caste, and one of the reasons that one of the explanations that I find compelling about it is perhaps the fact of endogamy, uh, which you've written about a lot. Endogamy among the Jatis in the north and the south and the west differs. The genetic disposition across India is very different, and it has remained consistent for a really long time. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, since we were talking about history earlier, I am of the belief that the Jati system predates the Aryans. So all the Indo-European societies start out with a tripartite caste system of like
Mm.
warriors on top, and then the priests, and then like the common people, the freeborn men. So these are all males. So one thing you notice in the Indian Varna system, it's rearranged. The priests are on top, so that's weird. So something weird is going on there. And then you add, these like, Dalits, untouchable outcast groups, and then you have like the Shudras, and I guess like they could be bondsmen, but anyway, most Indo-European societies have 3 Varnas, and they're not also like crazy strict. I think the Iranians were kind of strict. I don't think the priests intermarried too much with the nobles or the peasants, but there was actually the same system among the pagan Saxons in Germany, sort of. Right during the late Roman period, like the Romans said that there was a group of priests that were like not very powerful. They're shamans, they're priest kings, and then there were like the high nobles, and then the freeborn, right, the commoners. And so you had 3 castes in Saxony too, before whatever Christianization. but it wasn't like the Indian subcontinent where the endogamy is so strong, I think, in general, and there's no genetic evidence for really strong endogamy, I guess is what I'm saying. So I think the Jati, that's an Indian thing, and I think it's before Varna. Okay, so I think that's why the Indus Valley civilization seems to have been more decentralized, even though it had like good complexity and scale. There's like no massive palaces, no centralized structure. Some people wonder if it was an anarchy, like pre-government society. And I don't think that's true. I think that it just had like, segmentation along Jati pipelines, and that was preserved. The Aryans assimilated themselves into the Jati system and imposed on top of it a Varna complexity, if that makes sense. And in terms
Yeah,
of yeah, go on.
that point I think is recently made in the David Graeber and David Waingro's book, The Dawn of Everything, where they essentially argue that the Indus Valley civilization was a decentralized, anarchical structure. But I also think that there's evidence of a strict division among the groups, in the sense that there's clearly an emphasis on sanitation, and that the difference between purity and pollution is central to the caste system. So I think that
Yes.
difference existed probably in the Indus Valley civilization.
Yeah, so the way I think about a lot of these things is that so obviously most of India is Indo-European language speaking, but to understand what the Aryans, the Indo-Aryans, original ones were like, you got to look at other Indo-European speakers, and to understand what's unique about India, you have to see how India is different than the rest of them. You know what I'm saying? So, for example, and this is how you do in phylogenetics, okay? In every single Indo-European society, the rank order is warrior, priest, and commoner. In India, it's priest, warrior, and commoner. Okay, so like, what was it originally like? I'm assuming it was originally warrior, priest, and commoner, and it flipped somehow. Okay, so the Indian subcontinent flipped. These warrior elites that were meat eating,
Do
drunkards.
we have evidence that it was that way, that warriors were first and then it flipped?
Well, if you look at the older mythologies, it doesn't look like priests are the elite, right?
What are you referring to?
Well, I mean, if you just look at stuff like the Iliad, if you look at the Germanic mythology, like none of the other Indo-Europeans show the priests being at the top, right? That's an Indian thing specifically. So if all the other societies have it the other way, your presumption should be that that's the ancestral state, that India innovated. You see what I'm saying?
So you're arguing that it was not initially that way, that the initial formation was different in India, just like the rest of the world.
Well, so my argument is they probably had the normal rank order, and then when they came to
Okay.
the Indian subcontinent, they changed it, right? Like a lot of things change. So, for example, like vegetarianism, that's clearly not an ancestral Indo-European practice. Like they ate a lot of meat. I mean, it's in the Rig Vedas. I mean, even in the Rig
Yeah.
Vedas, they eat a lot of meat, right? So, but vegetarianism is an Indian innovation, right? So
We
my
also
argument
have
is like,
archaeological evidence on the Indus Valley civilization. They ate a lot of beef also.
yeah. I mean, vegetarianism is invented multiple times in different civilizations for various reasons. But you have to have like a complex stratified civilization. You have to have specialization. It doesn't work very well in an agro-pastoralist, non-specialized economy. In an agro-pastoralist, non-specialized economy, you eat everything. And you literally eat everything. You make use of every single part of the animal, right?
So the point, make the point that we are making initially.
Make what?
The point that we're making initially, which is that the difference between the different castes, how it is it came about.
Yeah, I mean, so genetically, as a lot of these caste groups seem to have emerged like within the last couple of thousand years. So I think this is like a little too strong, but David Reich's group and others say like it's during the Gupta period that a lot of this calcified. Obviously, the different caste groups emerged at different times, though, out of like different like fusions of different populations. So for example, like Brahmins in Bengal and Brahmins in Tamil Nadu, they're about 70%, or they're about like 25% indigenous. Like if you see a Brahmin that has East Asian ancestry and it's not like a Nepali Brahmin, if it's not like a Himalayan Brahmin, it's usually a Bengali Brahmin. And that's because Bengalis have East Asian ancestry and Bengali Brahmins assimilated some of the native Bengalis. In Tamil Nadu, it's the exact same, about 75% of the ancestry. It looks like to be similar to North Indian Brahmins, but 25% is different, right? But what happens is that in other societies, what would happen is they would keep intermarrying and there would be no genetic difference between Brahmins and non-Brahmins. But in India, they just stop. And then the endogamy goes way up. So there's periods of flux, right? There's periods of disruption, but then the endogamy kicks back in, and then you have the stabilization. Now, this doesn't happen anywhere else but the Indian subcontinent. It's like it's magical soil or something. So there's a lot of evidence now of Indian migration to Southeast Asia. They do have a Varna system. They don't really have a Jati system, from what I know. So the Balinese Hindus have a Varna system. And also the Hindus, the Vietnamese Hindus, the Chams have a Varna system. It's really not as important as in India, and they don't have a Jati system. And we know that all across mainland, all across Southeast Asia, there was clearly a lot of Indian migration about 2,000 years ago. There's a lot of R1AY chromosomes and stuff like that. So these people had caste when they came, they intermarried with the local people, they lost their identity and their distinctiveness. And so the Jati Varna system is very, very specific to the Indian subcontinent. Once you take Indians out of it, tends to disappear. Some like Hinduism can clearly preserve itself without it, because it still persists in Bali, a few parts of Java, and parts of Vietnam, right? And the Thai kings still have Thai Brahmins. So in Thailand, they do have a Brahmin caste, very, very small number of hereditary priestly families, and they serve the court, And they look Thai. They've obviously intermarried with the native Thai people.
So what are the hypotheses regarding why it happened? Was there some sort of perhaps some sort of political change which led to the emergence of strict endogamy?
No, I mean, nobody really knows. I mean, I can tell you, like most biologists that have looked at this think it's insane and don't really understand it. It's like, the way I've explained it to people is it's like encountering an alien society that don't behave like humans. Because humans tend to have sex a lot, and somehow the Indian subcontinent people just decided I'm not gonna have, I'm gonna be in the field, but like not gonna have sex with these people. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it's infanticide. I don't have a good explanation. I can tell you privately, biologists would not believe if it was real if they hadn't seen the result over and over again, because it's not biologically plausible. That's how I would say, because mammals don't behave like this normally, right? So there's like very strict social controls. I don't know. I live in America. We have sex with whoever we want. So I don't, I don't have a deep insight into this.
It's probably
No,
not
no,
because
no, no children though. No adult children. We have limitations. Just be clear. Yeah. So want to be clear on that.
it's probably not because of the caste system, which I think is often given an undue importance. It does not explain everything, because even then you'll have, uh, for instance, societies living in. It has to be from at the societal level. There has to be a sort of societal agreement that this is how it's going to be. And I don't think that unless there's a societal agreement that there's a centralized enforcement of it would ever work.
Yeah, I don't think it was. I mean, India doesn't do centralized too well. It's not like top down like China, or it's not organized that. I mean, even China wasn't as top down as people say. But anyways, the point is, it's a society with a weak state. So communal organizations, communal institutions have to take power. So those are the ones regulating it, right? So I don't know. I think it's quite plausible that infanticide rates, when people did step out, infanticide rates were high. That has to be, I think, to me, part of the explanation, because the stuff that I've seen about like rapes of upper caste men on lower caste women and stuff, it seems like they take the opportunity when they can get to it. So how do they preserve their genetic distinctiveness? It might just be like, okay, they know they're going to get raped and they just kill the babies because, that might be a problem in terms of like, you might not be able to get a husband if you have another, I mean, traditionally that's a difficulty, like getting a husband when you have another man's baby.
So in India, we also have the uh, other groups like the Austroasiatic tribes, the Sentinelese, the Javas, and I think what are their origins? Were they here because they're often referred to as original inhabitants, and it's
Yeah,
clear to me that they were not, that they there is
yeah,
likely that they came after the Aryans
yeah.
and the Dravidians.
Yeah, probably definitely after the Dravidians. So you're talking about the Austroasiatics. So these are mostly Munda when you're talking about it. The exception to that would be the Kazai, right? Of Meghalaya. They're Austroasiatic, but not Munda. But mostly they're Munda. They're people in Odisha, Jharkhand, I think, those areas. Some are in Telangana maybe, but anyway, so in the highlands, Chotanagpur, that area. And so, if you read the original like books from like the 80s or like, when I was a kid, they would say, oh, they're part of the original inhabitants and the Aboriginals. But their ancestry, they have a lot of East Asian ancestry. It's all paternal. None of it's maternal. So it's a bunch of East Asian men. They're Austroasiatic. They came from the South. So it used to be that people thought that they must have come in through Burma and then continued. I've talked to people who said like not very plausible because it's just really hard to penetrate through that direction, actually, because of the way the mountains are. And I now do believe that they probably came by sea, that they were all because they're all men. They probably came by sea. They probably came from, what is now like southern Burma or like northern Malay Peninsula, that kind of Isthmus of Kra, I think, that area. And they probably landed on the coast around Odisha. And the people that we see today are the remnants of people that were expelled or kicked out of the lowlands during later migrations. Genetically, depending on the group, they're like 20 to 35% East Asian. Their Y chromosomal lineages are quite East Asian. Their mitochondrial lineages are all Indian. And their language is obviously Austroasiatic. It's not it's Bunda, it's not Mon Khmer, it's like a different one. And one thing that's interesting is they have almost no Aryan ancestry. Their Indian ancestry is overwhelmingly like, Aboriginal or, East Iranian. So it's like it's like what I think happened, because they have no R1AY chromosome. What I think happened is the people that speak Munda today and the Munda people are the remains of people that were defeated by the Aryans as they were coming in from the northwest. And then they fled to the highlands, right? Because these are agriculturalists originally. Like they were originally dry rice farmers that arrived, and their culture is very distinct. Their mythology is very distinct. Like I don't remember the details, but I remember reading like a book about their mythologies once. It doesn't seem like anything Indian. It's like it's exotic. It's very different. So they have a very Southeast Asian culture that they brought, that they mixed into that culture. The Sentinelese, the Andaman Islanders are different because they're originally from Burma, actually. So those islands originally were connected to Burma, but they're obviously adjacent to the Indian subcontinent. They're distantly related to the Aboriginal people on the Indian mainland. Aboriginal insofar as like they're more connected to East Asians and Southeast Asians than they are to West Eurasians. Dark skinned, probably curlier hair, but I don't know. The idea that they were short and stuff like that, that's probably not true. Island people tend to be short. Andamanese tend to be small, but they're island people, right? The people on the mainland will not be island people, so they'll probably be like, dark skin, normal size, but very distinct looking. Some of these Aboriginal, ancient ancestral South Indian knows what the right lab calls, AASI. Some of these people, I think, probably did introduce rice agriculture or adopted or innovated rice agriculture into the eastern part of the Gangetic Plain. And they were assimilated by the incoming Aryans. And one of the dynamics that I think is notable is there are parts of, like if you look at Sindh has very little AASI ancestry. It's mostly Aryan on top of the IBC, right? The IBC itself has some AASI, but let's set that aside. If you look at, say, Brahmins in Bihar, parts of the Gangetic Plain, they have a lot more AASI, a lot more Aboriginal Indian than people in Sindh, but they also have more Aryan ancestry. And I think that this occurred because the Aryans came in through Khyber Pass, landed in Punjab, went south, and went east. When they went south and east, like to some extent, they didn't mix with the local people initially, like later they did. But you can imagine like whole Aryan tribes going in unmixed with any Dravidian ancestry, with any Indus Valley civilization ancestry. pushing into like Bihar. And there they meet the Aboriginal, AASI people, those tribes, and they mix with them. And so they produce this like hybrid population that have very little Indus Valley civilization ancestry, but a lot of Aryan ancestry and a lot of Aboriginal ancestry. Eventually, these groups got mixed with the Indus Valley people too, because all of that was connected in the Indian subcontinent as like a big gene flow matrix. So what you see in Swat Valley is that the proportion of Aryan ancestry goes from zero, very close to zero, to like 20 to 30%, right? But you also see the AISI ancestry go from very low to medium, to like 15, 20% from almost zero over time. So what does that mean? That means people from the outside are coming into Swat Valley in northern Pakistan now. And so not only were Aryans moving south and east, but the AISI Aboriginal ancestry was moving north and west. And why was it moving north and west? I think a lot of it just has to do with India, became what, they called Aryavarta, even in the Dravidian speaking areas in the south. And it became like one civilization matrix that people are moving around. And so people from the south are moving to the north, people from the north are moving to the south. It wasn't just one way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's also contradicts, I think refutes the traditional narrative, which is that the uh, Aryavata was essentially a strict society conquered by the people, and which is a political narrative that's kind of goes around in the so-called Hindutva circles, and you've had your own set of fight with them. Uh, I also wanted to talk about intelligence because I have had people on my show to talk about that. But before we do that, I wanted to know from you about personality traits, which is something that I'm interested in. And I was wondering what's the heritability of personality traits, because there's a paper by Jordan Peterson where he argues that personality traits are mostly heritable, and he's pointing to big five, and don't I'm not convinced of the scientific credibility of the big five personality traits in general. And there's also Jonathan Haidt, who makes the argument in The Righteous Mind, which is that your personality traits are not only heritable, but that the political differences are motivated from personality traits. So how far do you think personality traits per se are heritable, and how what are the categorizers that we can be absolutely sure of when it comes to that?
Yeah, so the one that scientists really like is Big Five. I'm not a personality psychologist, so I'm just gonna tell you what other people say. Myers-Briggs is more like, corporate thing. People say it's not scientific. Really, it's not that much worse than Big Five, but whatever. Big Five is the one that most people know about. And so Big Five are these components and these questionnaires there's 5 components that come out in terms of dimensions. So I think like agreeability, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion,
Neuroticism.
openness, and neuroticism. Yeah. And I mean, look, I see heritability estimates of like, 0.3, so 30%. And that seems reasonable to me. Heritability estimates, they tend to get stronger when you get a very precise, good construct of a behavior or a characteristic, right? When it's kind of fuzzy, the heritability estimates are lower because it's not as real, right? So to say that it's highly heritable, I think some of the subtraits could be highly heritable, but personality as a whole, I don't think it's highly heritable. Because what I would say is highly heritable if it's like 0.6, 0.7 or above. Okay, specifically. And this is the proportion of variance in the population that's due to variation in genes. Personality fluctuates over your lifetime, and it fluctuates by your cultural context a lot. And I know people who've been able to change their personality. It's much more easy to change, seems to me, than intelligence, So I don't think it's like a super heritable. It's heritable. People's parents, their personalities are like their parents. It's heritable, but it's not highly heritable. That's what I would say. As for whether it's like a good construct, I think it's okay, but it's not nearly as good as intelligence or other things like that. But it might just be really hard to get a grip on it because it's more protean than a paper and pencil intelligence test. It's like self-report. and cultural context and how you're feeling that day and all these things affect personality. Personality is, I think, a more pliant, more protean characteristic overall, and that's why it's harder to get a grip on. But it's real. I think it's real. Nobody would say that I'm introverted, and I'm quite like my mother that way. And one of my kids in particular, but maybe two of them are more like me. And then the third, the other child, my youngest is more like their mom, a very introverted person. So I don't think that's random.
And how do you think it differs between the sexes? Because it's often argued that you know the difference, the personality difference between the sexes is in large part biological in nature.
I mean, I think it probably is, but I mean, the person that all of these I don't know the details, and I don't want to speak off but the sex differences gets a little confusing because I also know psychologists they standardize their tests in a way to minimize sex differences sometimes, because they want an instrument that can be used to the whole population instead of saying you have to be a male or female, right? So that's part of the issue. So it might attenuate the sex differences, but it's neuroticism. Females are higher in neuroticism. Females are higher in agreeableness, somewhat higher in agreeableness, and I think those are the two main things that they're different in. I think they might be a little higher in conscientiousness, but definitely neuroticism and agreeableness, I always hear they're higher in those. And I think that drives a lot of the sex differences and the culture of men and women and the individual behavior of men and women. Those two things. And as far as politics, the correlation between liberalism or leftism and openness seems pretty robust, but it's not the strongest correlation in the world. So, it's partly so I mean, all of these things are moderately heritable, and they're correlations of correlations. So, it starts to get a little fuzzy down the line.
Well, I found it fascinating because the research that Jonathan Haidt cites in his book concerning libertarians. So libertarians seems to score the highest in openness, and they're also very high in not being this sensitive to disgust. Their disgust tolerance is extremely high. They're not disgusted by
Yeah,
anything at all, and there seems to be a
I mean, libertarians,
yeah.
I don't know what it's like. I mean, where do you live?
I live in Odisha,
All
India.
right. All right. Do you live in Cuttack or wherever?
Yeah, Bhubaneswar.
All right, whatever. Okay, so I don't know what it's like there. Libertarians in the United States tend to be young males, often kind of antisocial type people. Okay,
Mm.
so they're psychologically very strange. They're very strange. Okay, libertarians will, they'll explain why you should be able to deny, if there's someone going to an emergency, you can deny them access to your property because that's non-aggression principle. They have they're very abstruse, hyper rationalist people. I used to be pretty libertarian myself when I was younger, so I understand it. I go to Cato Institute events. I know a lot of anarcho capitalists. I know that whole scene, and they're just psychologically abnormal. So not shocking.
But they're also unique to Americans in a lot of ways because I don't find libertarian culture in other societies which are just as robust as the American libertarians. And I've had libertarians in this, so I've had David Friedman and Michael Humer, and both of them are anarcho-capitalists.
Yeah, yeah. I've met David before. I'm good friends with his son Patrick.
Yeah. So now I've also had people discussing intelligence, and I think this is something that you'll perhaps disagree with, which is the question of race and IQ. And we'll get to that. But first, I want to talk about uh, the state of intelligence today, because you often talk about how too many people are going to college. So, do you think that there is, as Charles Murray posits in his book, the bell curve, beginning of the bell curve, and then coming apart, that there's a widening gap between the sort of intelligent elites, high IQ people, and the commoners, and that gap is widening because they're separating from the rest of the society. So how true do you think is that scenario? Is this an assessment that you'll agree with?
I mean, so I think a lot of it's driven by economics, returns to skill, and intelligence are gaining, and like, there's been stagnation in lower skill wages since the 1970s, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of segregation, yeah, I think that's happening. I don't think it's happening like, well, I don't know. I haven't looked at the literature on that. I don't think the assortative mating rates are increasing, but I think the issue, for example, is like Americans are very individualistic. So, in the past, for example, you were Methodist because your parents were Methodist, your grandparents were Methodist, right? And people would just Methodist went to the Methodist church, and there's all people in the Methodist church, But today, Americans, they choose a lot more which churches they go to, and that tends to be like, and they're like, what are the vibes of the church, So sometimes there's some church, and it's like all like young, conservative, professional people that are highly educated. So if you're like, let's say it's a conservative church, and you're a conservative Christian, but you work at McDonald's, you don't want to go to that church. But there's another church where it's like, everyone's kind of more working class, it's not, you wouldn't feel out of place, And so I think segregation is starting to happen socio-professionally, just because we have so much freedom of choice in the civil society that we participate in. I do interact with a fair number of people that don't have college degrees, but that's partly because I'm in tech. But I don't interact with people that are working class very often. Yeah, I don't. I'm trying to think. Oh, my wife, she has cousins that are working class. Yeah. Sorry. I was thinking, I don't know. Don't clip this. Wait. Yeah, she has cousins that are working class. I mean, I'm trying to think of like the last time I hung out with, I think that was it. Yeah, family reunions or things like that. Oh, one of my brothers, well, he had some problems. Well, whatever. I don't want to get into it. Personal stuff. He's not really working class. He just cannot hold that regular job because he has attitude problems. But I don't want to get into that. But yeah. So I guess there is a lot of segregation. Maybe I don't know if I'm typical though. So I don't want to overgeneralize. But yeah, I don't interact with a lot of different types of people, socioeconomically, I guess. I interact with a lot. I'm not liberal, I'm pretty right wing, but I interact with a lot of liberal people at like tech events and stuff like that. So I do have some ideological diversity, even if I'm not super tight with a lot of different left wing people. But yeah, it's definitely class stratification. I live here in Austin. It is a very segregated city in a way. Like I would say, like the difference between I live in California. I'm from the West Coast. I'm from Oregon. I see more Latinx people here, a lot more, but I still don't interact with Black people very often. They live in a different part of town. They have a different social network, I think. But Asians and whites kind of interact with each other. People of Asiatic origin. So and then we see some of these Latinx people in terms of socially and stuff like that. There's some overlap there, although there's a wide range because some of them have like lived here for generations and others are new, and they're working in kind of like landscapers, that sort of thing. But the Black community stays to itself, so it's racially segregated, I would say, even though it's a very liberal city.
So I think what Charles Murray is driving at, and I loved his book Coming Apart. I'd love to talk to him someday. So he saying that because of that
I mean, wait,
segregation,
have you emailed Chuck?
I have emailed him, and I think his assistant replied that you just 2 pieces.
I mean, I
If you
can
can,
like email him. I'm
yeah,
friends with him.
yeah. So maybe we can set it up afterwards. So so one thing that he's driving at is perhaps that because of the segregation, that the values, that because the liberals have certain values, so they lay more value to college degree than it should be given. So because they care about it, they think that everyone else cares about it. And so intelligence becomes like something that everyone ought to have. So there's a political campaign to equalize outcomes to ensure that everyone has access to college degrees. And it comes with the idea that college that intelligence is actually the most important thing.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's definitely like a professional managerial class, like bias. I do think college degree and credentialism, there's also a gendered element to it. Women are really super into credentials. They love to get more master's degrees, you know. Men don't, I don't think we care as much about that sort of thing. So, you know, the rise of credentials and that I have a degree and I have a PhD and all this stuff, but it tends to be from liberal women in particular. They love their credentials. Whereas like I feel like you know, and it's not just men, but like it's a more masculine thing to be like, we don't care what your credentials are. What can you do? You know, I mean, I don't really give a shit if you're a PhD. I don't care. You know, it's like if you're being stupid, you're being stupid, right? So there's a cultural difference there in different areas of society. I think the professional managerial class, like white collar, you know, it's like kind of like pencil pusher types, bureaucrats, human resources, those people, they're really into credentials. And yeah, they do value intelligence because you know, they see it as something you can earn, and it's something, you know, measure of your conscientiousness, of your hard work and stuff like that. Implicitly, it's like a measure of your moral worth. And so that's become a thing. Um, I mean, I don't know that's again, like I come from a pretty well-educated family and I'm a nerd, so I've always thought intelligence was important. So I don't know how it's changed to the last 40 years. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, Chuck's idea is fine. I haven't looked at all the research. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me that it's spread as norms spread through society about from the elite of what is and isn't important. And so, for example, like going to college, like I recently was looking at some of the data. About 10 times more women today have college degrees with an IQ of 90 or below than they did a generation ago. You know, and that's just because like a lot of women thought going to college and getting a bachelor's degree is a ticket to the middle of class, social status, et cetera, et cetera. So it's debased the college degree, you know.
So I think that I'm quite convinced of his argument because, Michael Sandel has a recent book called The Tyranny of Merit, where he essentially argues that the uh, populist movements around the world is actually a fight against the credential list elites. And there is some certain truth to that. When you think about, say, Donald Trump, when you think about uh, even in India, when you think about Modi, there's this clearly a uh, constant fight against, the education emphasis and that, and the working class seems to be justifiably angry at that, and the populist movement, both on the left and the right, is a reaction to the credentialism of the neoliberals. You're muted.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. You're 100% right about that. And like we've seen this under Trump, a lot of moderate, not even moderate, like a lot of like professional class Republicans defected while he got the working class from the Democrats. So it's like we've had class inversion where suburban districts that used to be reliably Mitt Romney, you know, even like 10, 15 years ago, are now Democrat. It's because like they have an aversion to Trump's populist stance, which seems anti-intellectual, anti-educational, anti-merit. And it's just that is how it's shaking out. And that's one reason like professionally educated but conservative leaning women have massive issues under the Trump regime, under the Trump administration, because they did not like him, and it was like it was a reptilian brain thing.
Yeah. So why don't you start, because I want to talk about uh, heritability and IQ. So what is the value of IQ, the predictive value of IQ? First of all, what is IQ? What is the value of IQ, and why uh, does it matter? How much scientific credibility can we give to that idea?
Yeah, so the easiest way to think about IQ is intelligence quotient, kind of a generic term. I mean, I think technically what most people think about when they're psychometricians about IQ is the general intelligence factor, which is basically pulling out the general factor, the correlation across all these different intelligence tests. And the general intelligence factor, the loading of a test with the general intelligence factor will predict how you're doing on a IQ on a test. So like if you take, I don't know, Analogies test, word analogies test, highly G loaded. Your IQ is going to predict how you're going to do it on word analogies test. Something else like, I don't know, how well you play Monopoly is not as G loaded. There's a lot of random elements to that. So there might be some correlation because Monopoly still has some skill level, but there's a lot of randomness, like when you're doing a dice, tossing a dice and stuff like that, right? I forget, like there's certain like IQ tests or mental tests that aren't very G loaded, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. So IQ, general intelligence factor, which shows how well you do on the test. But is that all it shows? No. Your IQ, your intelligence measure, so is correlated like 0.5 with your income across the population. It's correlated 0.5 with your GPA outcome, which doesn't seem like a lot, but there's a very high correlation in social science. So it's one of the most predictive instruments of your outcomes is your IQ. Does it predict everything? No. There's poor people with high IQs. They're called communists. This is why I think like communism and leftism emerge, because they're very angry that they're smarter than people who are doing better than them. But it's just part of the noisiness of the system. There's rich people with low IQs. They're called realtors. So you don't hear much about from realtors because they're just really glad that they have money because they know that they should be broke. Like they're stupid, and so they're like, oh, they feel very lucky. The people you hear from are poor people with high IQs because they feel like they don't deserve that because they're better than other people because they have high IQs. Just that's how they feel. So it's predictive of a lot of things in terms of heritability. The estimates you usually see are like 0.5 to 0.8 or 0.4 to point, and it depends on the environment. It depends on which how you control for things like shared parental, like a parental input, and there's shared environment, non-shared environment, and then just the genetic component, which is the heritability, what you're talking about. And in upper middle class Western environments, I'd say it's moderately high, like 0.6 seems to be a good conservative estimate. And we're starting to detect the genes for it with genomic methods now. So we can do a polygenic score index, whatever, to predict your IQ from your genes. Again, it's only a correlation, partly because it doesn't get everything, but they're actually not that bad. They get the rank order correctly, usually among siblings and other things, if there's a high difference. So we know a lot. It's a very useful instrument. We don't know exactly how it emerges mechanistically with neuroscience. Genetically, we're starting to know. And it's supposedly controversial because different populations score differently on them. So that's basically what it is.
How reliable do you think IQ measures are, historically speaking? Can we map out the IQs of people historically? Say the IQ tests were invented around, say, 1900s, 20s, 30s,
Yeah, I mean,
and the early tests were pretty unreliable because I've seen those tests, and they're often explicitly racist. They'll have a picture of a black child and a white child, and they'll pick which one of them is more beautiful. So there's a reliability
well,
problem.
I mean, it's not even reliability. That's just like basically like okay, so those tests, I mean, that's not a G-loaded test, right? That's not a culture fair test, right? So the most culture fair tests, I think, Raven's progressive matrices, which are like the shape rotation type thing, right? But even stuff like analogies, like I mean, they're not that bad. So the early ones are pretty bad. They've gotten better. The way that you show that a test is not biased, so there is a way that you show that the test is not biased. So for example, like Black Americans score lower than white Americans on a lot of standardized tests. But what Educational Testing Service does is it looks to see if your score on the test predicts, say, your grade point average. So I told you an IQ test, a standardized SAT or an ACT, whatever, they predict your grade point average with an R, your Pearson's correlation coefficient of 0.5. Okay, if the test is biased in a given population, it's not going to predict the grade point nearly as well, right? So if a test is like culturally biased against one group, but they do really well in this math course, that means that, I mean, the test is culturally biased. The test will have a low correlation. And so what they try to do, what these companies are trying to do, is make sure that the correlation is the same across all subpopulations between men and women, blacks and whites and stuff like that. That doesn't mean that the outcomes are the same, Because all they're trying to see is that the test can predict to the same extent. If the test can predict to the same extent, that means that the bias is not that strong. Does that make sense? Because all that the test exists for in the United States is to predict things, predict how well you'll do at school ahead of time. That's all, right? The underlying like biological reality or anything like that is irrelevant.
So on the heritability of intelligence, and I want to separate this from the difference between race and IQ because those are very different things. And it's obvious to me that uh, intelligence is heritable. I think there's enough evidence, partially heritable, not completely obvious, of course, not completely, of course. So intelligence is partially heritable, but it's not obvious to me it whether the difference between intelligence among different so-called races, if are going to classify it as such, how much of that is heritable. It's not obvious to me that it is.
Yeah, I mean, what are you asking me? Like in terms of what question are you asking me there? You made a bunch of statements. Like, what do you want me to
Yeah,
answer?
I'm asking you whether it's heritable across races.
Well, I mean, it's obviously heritable. It's obviously heritable across races in terms of its heritability. The heritability exists in all populations. What you're asking is the difference between the groups due to heritable differences, right?
Yeah,
And I mean, I mean, probably some of it is, honestly. So the way I would think about this is if you have two separate populations and they're genetically distinct in a lot of ways, and let's say that there's no strong, basically stabilizing selection. Okay, so for example, there are mutations that cause different numbers of fingers, but those mutations are strongly selected against. Having fewer or more than these number of fingers is not adaptive. Okay, so all populations have 5 fingers on average, right? There's strong stabilizing selection. There's other things that are like height. There is selection for height, but it's not as strongly stabilizing, and you see variance, right? And so that means the outcome of height is due to a combination of well, I mean, in terms of why the distribution is what it is, natural selection, or selection of some sort. I'm not going to stipulate natural, and then random genetic drift and maybe migration with other populations, but ultimately it's just random drift and mutation, right? Mutation also happens randomly, but let's assume mutation is like a fixed parameter across populations in terms of its effect. Whatever, like let's ignore that. So different populations are genetically differentiable when it comes to population genetic tests because of drift. Because when they're separate from each other, they start drifting apart, right? Because the drift happens in different ways. And so if you have a quantitative trait, like height, and it's due to genetic differences, it's due to genetic variation, and drift is it's not like strongly stabilizing selection controlled, it's somewhat selection controlled. People start to get have problems, like men over 6'3" have higher mortality, et cetera, et cetera. People that are too short, they start to have problems, like women can't give birth correctly, they're too small, stuff like that. Okay, so people are in a range, but within that range there's not strong selection, and different populations are different heights. We now know that different populations are different heights, at least partly due to genes. Like this is very well known because we know the genes for height better than the genes for intelligence, because the genetic architecture is about 10 times simpler. Like there's probably like a tenth as many genes that are impacted, so like 1,000 instead of 10,000 or whatever. It's a little bit of like an exponential distribution, so it's not like uniform effects across each gene. But anyways, set that aside. This distribution is affected partly by random genetic drift, which means that you start out with two uniform distributions that are exactly the same, and you expect them to shift off at some point. You can't necessarily you can have expected value for the magnitude difference, but basically in most of the simulations you run, they're going to be somewhat different, right? So the prior for this quantitative trait should be that there should be some difference. The question is the magnitude of the difference, which you can't necessarily predict because it's random, or the direction of the difference, right? So what I'm saying there is yeah, you can say that if populations were not genetically distinct, you shouldn't assume any necessarily difference. That's a fine prior, but we know they're genetically distinct. So you should have a prior that if it's a quantitative trait, not under strong stabilizing selection, it should be genetically different. Now, maybe intelligence is under strong stabilizing selection. I don't actually think it is, but maybe it is. right? If it was under strong stabilizing selection, I think there should be less variance because the distribution should be squeezed in to whatever midpoint value you want, but whatever. We know that there's selection for height. Taller men in particular seem to be like more sexually fit. But if you get too tall, you start dying of heart attacks and all these other things. Also, in a society that would be calorie deprived, which is like a lot of pre-modern societies, you're gonna die during a famine because you have higher calorie needs. So there's all sorts of factors like that that are affecting it. So if you want to think about priors, okay, there's a prior that there should be different. Now, empirically, why are they different? We don't necessarily know. Okay, probably because there hasn't been enough study. We are studying the genetic architecture of intelligence, but really a lot of it's done in Europeans. Partly because it's controversial. You want to do the Europeans first, and then nobody will criticize you. I mean, look, I think this is well known. I think this has been written about. Some like scientific organizations in the United States have been blocked from accessing data now. That might shed light on this question. They're not even like asking to look at that, but the data is usable in that way because they're worried that they'll find adverse results, right? So, if they thought that there was nothing to worry about, why should they block access to the data, right? But so I don't know. I mean, this is not an issue that's going to be solved in the United States. We don't have the political will or inclination to look, but science is probably there, probably be like figured out in the next like decade or so,
So, well, one of the reasons that I think the context in which this debate is raised is, of course, black and white IQ differences, and the Flynn effect shows that difference is increasingly widening. And I think the last paper of
I know.
the
I think
measure.
I thought it was stabilizing. I thought Charles Murray's latest book seems to indicate stabilizing or shrinking maybe a little.
So the last measure of it was, I think, in a paper in 2009 by Flynn, which is
Yeah.
9 points. Murray thinks it's 15 points.
Okay.
The difference between black and white, and I don't know where he gets the data from, but he makes a claim in his podcast with Sam Harris. But the paper that I could find, the most recent, which is 2009 by Flynn, says it's 9 points. And in 1940s, it was double differences. So what happened? How do you explain the Flynn effect? Is it because of I mean, it obviously seems to be because of environmental reasons, because it's
Yeah.
a
Well,
short time.
I think the Flynn effect is just basically people are. I mean, I've seen weird things like people might be getting better at like reaction time IQ tests, because kids play video games, right? I mean, it's like we're in a particular type of environment, and people do better at these sorts of tests than they did in the past because life is one big test, is the way that people say it, and I think that's true. So, for example, literacy. I happen, if you read Stanislaw Dehani's book about literacy, literacy is actually localized in a particular part of the brain, and that part of the brain recognizes shapes in the environment. And it turns out like people that are very illiterate are not that great at remembering and recognizing environmental shapes. Okay. Whereas illiterate foragers are very good. So what's happening there is we're reallocating resources to recognize letters as opposed to like shapes of rocks or whatever, right? So we have a finite amount of number of neurons, and we're reallocating and restructuring to do at things that are correlated with these tests, which I think is fine because the tests are predicting things about like the IQ test does not predict necessarily. I mean, it probably does predict a little bit how good of a hunter you are, but not very much. Okay. It mostly predicts like how good of a CPA or an accountant you can be, or how good of a theoretical physicist you are, or something like that. Like all of these sorts of, or like how good of a supermarket worker you can be. I worked at a supermarket when I was a kid. And well, I mean, I don't know what they're like in India, so I'm speaking for America. But there's a lot of complex tasks you have to do. It's not rocket science, but you gotta like I worked in like the back and I like stocked, and you have to have like prioritize things and all this stuff and manage your time. It's not all
How
like
good is it at predicting creative abilities, music and art?
Not
acting
very
and
good. I mean, I don't think IQ is like. I think people with high IQ tend to be better, but I think creativity is a somewhat different characteristic, and it's correlated with like openness. It is actually correlated with schizophrenia. So I don't know. It is correlated with schizophrenia. I mean, you're imaginative. You know, you let your imagination get. I mean, schizophrenia could be the outer end of kind of human imaginativeness. Your imagination is more important to that reality.
right. So the implications of that is, I think, whether we can have policies which improve IQ points. Do you think that's possible? And the reason I'm asking you this is because uh, Murray's co-author Richard Bernstein did an experiment in one of the Latin American countries where he actually, in a small gap of time, increased the IQ points of students in a college by modifying the education system. And Durkheim, his studies show that the differences can be increased depending upon your socioeconomic status. If you're adopted into a parent with higher income or higher IQ, the chances of the kid having a
Yeah,
higher IQ, regardless of the race, is
yeah. So what I know about the literature on that is the effect. The effect is initially strong, but it decays over time. And so the reason is when you do an intervention, you control someone's life. So you're like controlling the background variables. And so yes, you have an initially strong outcome, but if you track them longitudinally over their life, the effect tends to be weaker as people converge back onto their final track. And the reason that they converge is they start making choices that are different than what the initial intervention was, and that starts causing a feedback loop that turns them back in the initial path. So what I would say is like you obviously can improve your abilities in the short term, but like unless you want to be like, there are people like rich people that I know, tech millionaire type people. Tech, you have to be tech centimillionaire to be able to do this, right? Not a millionaire. But that take courses and boot camps and trainings all the time, and they're just like doing things all the time to keep themselves up there. It's a lot like, to me, it's a lot like working out. Like you work out, you get in shape, and then you stop and you get out of shape. But if someone forces you to work out again, you get back in shape. Does that make sense? So there are people who push themselves to work out their whole life. And, I mean, so for example, imagine you have like an IQ of like 110, which is okay. But you're very conscientious. So you push yourself really, really hard all your life. I mean, you might not necessarily do as well on an IQ test, but you will have good realized outcomes. I know people like this, and then other people who have an IQ, you have an IQ of 140, but you have issues with conscientiousness, you have attention ADD, attention deficit disorder, and so you do okay in life, but it's because you're very smart. You can catch yourself and fix it and correct things. And I know people like that too. The outcomes are kind of similar. Arguably, the person with the 140 IQ that's lower conscientious is much more stressed out because they're really like not working effectively, whereas the person with a 110 IQ is making the most of themselves. So combining IQ and personality is probably like if you're an extremely high conscientious, high IQ person, you can be a great doctor, great surgeon, great lawyer, those sorts of things. Being in the tech entrepreneurial space, I sometimes do wonder if being like in the middle of conscientiousness is better for being an entrepreneur, because what people that are extremely conscientious tend to do is they find the best choice or the best outcome in the short term, and then they follow that, and then they follow the next best outcome and the next best outcome, which can get them stuck in a local optimum, if that makes sense. Whereas if you have moderate conscientiousness, you have enough conscientiousness to follow through and do things, but sometimes you do crazy things. People who are extremely conscientious do not do crazy things, but startups, new businesses are crazy things often, and that's why most of them fail, but some of them succeed, and then you're rich. So
but they for people to do crazy things, they also have to be high in openness, I think.
yeah. That, I mean, that's just a precondition for, I think, a lot of professions. maybe if you're a CPA, some sort of back office thing, you can be low in openness. But I mean, even if you're say like if you're a doctor, you're interacting with lots of different people. I mean, you have to do a lot of gross things. You got to be open. Your discuss can't be that high. Does that make sense? Like if you're a professional, quite often you have to be very open. The exception would be like, if you're like a high level software engineer and you work just in front of the, you know what I'm saying? But if you're a professional that interfaces with the public, you have to be open.
Yeah, so I think so what are your opinions on, say, the social concerns for this kind of research? Because I think that is exactly what's delaying the uh, ability to ask questions on this, because this has kind of become unsayable, and because of that, we're not going to have definitive answers in the near future, because this is not something that's considered to be politically correct research. So, and there's a problem with this. The problem with this is that it sort of outsources all of the dialogue to the politically motivated ideologues. It outsources the dialogue to actual racists, and you never want to do that. But this is exactly what, say, the so-called progressive culture is doing to scientific research.
I don't really have a good the United States, we're not gonna like study these sorts of questions. Just because the cultural science has moved beyond it, they consider them racist and et cetera, et cetera. I think probably like China is gonna figure out a lot of this stuff, and we're gonna say the Chinese are lying or ignore it because they're Chinese. The truth is out there, it'll be found, and that's what it is. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be acknowledged in the short to medium term in the United States. So whatever, unless the truth is exactly what American progressive elites want, no one will know about it here. They will make sure that nobody hears about it, if that makes sense. But other cultures and other societies don't have the same taboos. They have different taboos maybe, but not these taboos. So the truth will be found.
Technically, I don't even find it being I don't even find it being politically inconvenient for progressive. I think Catherine Page Harden has made a very good argument in the genetic lottery that this is not inconsistent with social justice. And I lean quite progressive.
Yeah, so that's fine, but she's been called I know her. She lives in town, so I know her. I've known her since 2016. I've been over to her house and stuff, but we're not like super close friends. I just don't want people to cancel Catherine Owens, but Paige. Look, she's been called a Nazi, so I mean it's fine, but you can say the it should be okay with progressives, but they're not okay with it. So I mean, there have been really some funny memes about her, like 1,000 years in the future, there's gonna be great statues of her, and like gonna be like Nazi, like will to power, like I don't know, triumph of the will type marches around her great statue. But like they turn her into like a fascist Nazi empress, which that's like it's stupid, but that's what they do. So yeah, I don't know. Like that's fine. I mean, I understand your logical perspective, but I think you're a high decoupler, maybe, and you're thinking about this too rationally. Most people have feelings, so the feelings are that this stuff is racist because IQ is a racist concept that only benefits white males. That's what they think. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm not
Yeah,
saying I think that, but that's going to be the reaction.
but it's also important. The category of race may not be as important, because I think the category of race is politically contingent, and Charles Murray has given away using that. He does not use the term anymore in his recent book, Human Diversity. And I think that
Yeah.
Clusters, Klein's, Joseph L. Graves do not
Yeah,
use the term.
I know all that stuff. I mean, like, population structure is real. Race is, you can define it in various ways, and I don't know, but operationally, it still matters. And operationally, the problem is like, unless there's equity between all races on all things, like progressives will get mad, and there's not going to be equity, and so therefore they're going to stay mad. I don't know. That's my like rough rule of thumb here. That's what I've seen. I mean, and it's like until everything is equal, like they're into equity. They want everything equal. That means that, you
So
know,
there's also a lot of talks about gene editing, which was halted in 1999 because of the death of Jesse Singer, I think his name was. So how far are we? Where are we when it comes to gene editing and finding medical therapies
yeah.
using that method?
Yeah, I mean, so we're not, I mean, so I think they just sickle cell, they did sickle cell, and I think they've started to cure ALS. Uh so yeah, like I mean that stuff is happening, it's serious. Uh and like people are being cured, okay? And people will be cured. Now there's gonna be some issues, there's gonna be some problems. Everything makes uh you know errors, but that stuff is like, so what I have read, I wrote this like 8 years ago. We are like in the forefront of the reading the genome revolution. The next, like the second half of the 21st century is going to be writing the genome revolution. We will rewrite the human genome, we will rewrite our own code, but we're not very good at it right now. So it's mostly to like cure like really bad disease like cystic fibrosis, ALS, and sickle cell and ALS I think have been cured now. um uh, and like there are cystic fibrosis ones that are uh that have been cured, and there's a lot of CRISPR work in plants and animals for animal breeding and stuff like that. That's going to make a difference. But really, I think we're going to see like a lot of congenital Mendelian disease cured in the next 10 to 30 years, a lot of them. So it's a big deal. Yeah.
There's
So
also promising research by Siddhartha Mukherjee on curing cancer using gene. Uh, and depression as well, cancer and depression. There's a lot of promising research going on right now uh, on curing both those diseases, and I think in few decades perhaps we'll find out.
yeah. No, I mean, I don't know as much about that. That's a little down the line, but we discovered quote unquote CRISPR 11 years ago. So this was very, very early, very, very early. Um, Engineering takes decades to really refine itself. So, but it's a real deal. It's going to transform everything, but not yet. Not yet. It'll
So that's
transform your life if you have cystic fibrosis.
there are concerns about gene editing that I think are uh, pretty valid. For instance, let's say we are able to edit genes in a way that we are able to produce people who are more intelligent than others. Then we're going to have a society where those with access are going to use this method to have more intelligent people. And given the untenability of that, you have poor people demand equality of outcome. So at a certain point in time, it's likely that it's going to be either very unequal or it's going to be a situation where it's mandatory for you to use that method.
Yeah, I don't know if it's mandatory, but I think there'll be subsidies. I think there'll be people who want to be naturals. I think a lot of science fiction is going to come true, probably. There's going to be Amish when it comes to gene editing resistors and all these things. Not resistors, but people that opt out. And that's just going to be a whole thing. And we're going to have a discussion. And I think there's going to be diversity based on that.
It's also going to impact, say, value. So for instance, if we find a gene that makes people more susceptible to be gay or trans, then you have a situation where you can ensure that your kid is actually not gay. And that is a situation where values come in, right? And we're not thinking about that because the ones who are doing the research happen to be progressives.
Yeah, to some extent, but they are worried about it. I think they are worried about it. Right now, though, the research is mostly aimed at disease stuff. And so that is why most people are not thinking too much about the values. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, as it becomes common, people will think about the values and people will make choices. I don't know how, yeah. So it's an interesting question. I mean, it's gonna be an interesting question. It'll be an interesting couple of decades.
So do you think that the research, because the only way to regulate it now is right now. I mean, if we go too far, if we make these developments, then there's no coming back. Once the technology is done, it's done. We cannot return back to where we are. So if we're going to regulate it, the time to start is right now.
Yeah, the issue is it's very cheap and it's very easy, and there's a lot of countries. So we need a global, this cannot be a local nation by nation thing. If you want that, we need a global consensus and global enforcement. Because this is not like nuclear power. Like this is gonna be pretty easy in a lot of ways, you know.
That is quite a dismal way to end this. But I think gene editing is going to help us in a lot of things. It's going to cure some diseases. It probably will get rid of
Well,
cancer.
it's already curing some diseases. So, like I said, like people have already been cured of sickle cell and ALS. Cystic fibrosis is next. Those were the first three that they were targeting. Eventually, the goal is to cure all Mendelian diseases because they're Mendelian. We know what genes to target, and so that's hundreds of diseases. Probably like 5% of the population, has some sort of Mendelian disease, depending on how you define it. 5 to 10%, but definitely 5%. So cure those people first, and then you're Indian, maybe we can do some gene editing. People can have you need to worry about any fair and lovely, just kind of put the CRISPR treatment. I think unfortunately it might be a little awkward when everyone turns into an albino and they realize they don't want that, but I don't know. I don't know, man. I mean, because that's actually a pretty trivial change. Because we know most of the genes for pigmentation. That's actually not that hard. It's very easy. We could do that within the next. Hey, if there's any Indian VCs out there, after my next startup, I got an idea for you. And we could make a lot of money off 1.4 billion Indians. I mean, actually, most Asians probably would buy this product. So I think that's a funnier way to end it. Maybe a little disturbing, but
On a cost note, we need to do the trade-offs. So, all right.
Yeah.
I had a great fun talking with you, and so everyone watching this, like, subscribe, and links will be in the description to follow Razib wherever in social media and YouTube. Having a great day.